Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Dr. Matthew Nagra, it's an honor to have you on here. I've been enjoying the hell out of your media, and you're one province over. I'm in Edmonton, Alberta. You're in Vancouver, British Columbia, so fellow Canadian. And you're a naturopathic doctor. And a lot of your stuff is about information about plant-based nutrition, amongst other things. And you've been doing a good job of fighting the misinformation we see online. Let's start here. Your voice and image has actually been hijacked by someone using AI, right? Talk about misinformation, fighting it, and then someone's using your image and voice to spread misinformation, to sell bogus products. What the hell happened there?
I have no idea. And it's funny. I'll try not to make it too long, but I'll give a little bit of a background on like how that came to be or how I came to find out about it. I had a couple people, I woke up one morning, just messaged me like, hey, you should check this out with a link. And it was like in my requests folder on Instagram. And I just thought, I get so many of these. I didn't think too much of it. And then probably I don't know, an hour later, Dr. Ids, who ended up making a video on this, he actually messaged me. He's like, hey, heads up, I'm making a video on you today. I was like, uh-oh, what's this about? And he's like, well, it's not actually you, but someone using AI. And I was like, oh, that must be what they were talking about. So of course, at that point I looked and yeah, it's kind of scary, this person's out there talking about like heart disease symptoms and how to prevent or treat a heart attack and promoting, some bogus supplement. And so there's sort of two sides of the coin. For one, it could be very dangerous information for somebody. And on the other side, it's also harming my credibility. If somebody thinks it is me. And I had a number of people commenting on Dr. Id's video being like, oh, for a minute, I thought that was real. And, like that's ultimately what makes it most scary. And it's only going to get better and better as the years go on here with the technology.
And that's what I was curious about is what do you think the implications are both on your side or the people, because you're not the only person who's been a quote victim of this. And it certainly will only get better to be more easily fool people, because I saw it on Dr. Id's thing as well. That's actually how I came on to this conversation. And I'm thinking like, whoa, like what's going on here? What's he getting called out for? And then once you pay attention, you realize, wait a second, no, this is rubbish. But it wasn't obvious just by looking at it right away.
Yeah, though I find that the first few seconds or so were definitely the most convincing. And then as you get into it, just the cadence of speech and stuff, it's not me. And maybe the voice doesn't quite line up with the mouth at certain points. But the thing is, like, you follow my content, you know how I speak. Obviously I do, and people close to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how others will see it. Like people who have no idea who I am, and then they see that, maybe they take it to be real or something, and so that's where it's a little more concerning.
And you certainly think that it's going to get worse.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, that's a guarantee. Even if you look at a year ago to now, it's gotten a lot better. So the AI stuff's only going to take off from there.
And is there any recourse to deal with this?
So I actually spoke with, well, for one, I reported a bunch of the videos to both Meta and to TikTok. They didn't take them down because apparently it doesn't go against their community standards, which is bizarre. Even when I'm reporting it as, you can select, they're imitating someone, and who are they imitating? Me. I literally put that in there. No, it doesn't go against their standards, so it's fine. And then I had a friend who has a rather large following, and she does recipe videos. And she said that somebody used her image and voice to promote some cookware in a similar fashion with AI. And she actually went the legal route. She talked to lawyers and everything. And by the sounds of it, the law hasn't quite caught up with the tech at this point. And so there actually aren't really laws in place to deal with this. And she ultimately couldn't do anything other than try to ignore it or, not give it attention. And that was one of the things too, that I was thinking about, like, how much, attention do I want to give to this? Or, I mean, I'm glad, I think that Dr. has put that video out and at least, gave a bit of a warning to people in general about, this is out there. But at the same time, like, will more people see that and be like, hey, that's a good idea, I should do that? Like, I don't know.
This episode is brought to you by K&KG, my favorite gym bag brand, and now my favorite backpack for travel. I used to travel like an amateur and check suitcase. This meant hassle checking in, waiting for luggage, and stress over whether my bag would make it to my destination with me. Even my roller carry-on didn't allow for versatility once I got to my destination. And I travel more than ever, and I need quality, durability, and convenience. And when I met up with friends at fitness conferences, I noticed many traveled just with a backpack. So I started researching backpacks and brands. And I kept coming back to KNKG because I've had one of their duffel bags for years. So I bought their Edge backpack that goes everywhere with me. And my KNKG backpacks, plural, now I have two of them, the Edge and the Conquer backpack, double as perfect travel bags for a week of travel or everyday gym use. And I can save you 15% on yours. Go to www.knkg.com/Andrew59676. That's www.knkg.com/Andrew59676, or go to the link in the show notes. It's very likely that whoever did this may not be in the continental United States or even North America. It's probably, they're probably doing it from some jurisdiction that, even if there were some legal recourse, it's not going to change anything anyway.
Yeah.
I think Meta and their policies have to play catch up with this stuff and deal with it fairly aggressively. At least with YouTube, one of the things that they came out and they announced that they've, I think, completely demonetized AI generated video, right? Which at least reduces the incentive to create this stuff. This is wandering a bit far afield, but there's been some discussion about even AI-based music being generated. I've got a client who came in, there's this app called Sono, I think it is, and he'll just put in a few cues and it just produces obviously very derivative music. You kind of pick a genre. You can't say, make it sound like the band Tool that I love, but you can actually literally describe every aspect of Tool or Pink Floyd, and it'll produce something that's quite similar. But there's a band, I can't remember the name, but I think they're either confirmed or very overwhelmingly alleged to be an AI-based band that has generated a huge subscriber base, follower base on Spotify. And it sounds kind of generic, but it also sounds pretty impressive. And so if you've got those platforms and there's an incentive for someone to make this stuff and then profit from it, from the plays and put on blast, because I think there was also some stuff about someone was uploading bullshit to SoundCloud and had bots listen to it on repeat and making a whole bunch of money until that got caught. But at least YouTube reduces one of the incentives. But I guess the incentive in the case of social media is to fool people into selling bullshit. So,
yeah.
Now, what do you think about the consumer end of things? What's the responsibility of the person who's watching this crap?
I mean, I don't know how much of the responsibility for somebody doing that I would put on the consumer. But one thing that I would highlight, and I think this becomes more and more important, is looking out for verification, especially if it is somebody, or at least a video like that or an account like that, where there were a ton of followers and that, I mean, they weren't verified. So that's one issue. Whereas, if you see my videos, you'll see the check. If you see Dr. Idge or these other people, you'll see the check. At least that is really them, that they've had to submit their ID and that, that's something that you can look out for. But again, I think there needs to be more done. I think you're right on the front of Meta or TikTok or one of these companies, Google, to crack down on it, because I don't know that just having and putting the onus on the consumers is going to do too much here.
Fair. So it's not as simple as caveat. And one more thought to all this. And I don't do a lot of video-based media. I know I kind of need to embrace it. There's also this part of me that is just averse. I'm not interested in stuff that tends to be super polarizing, that someone else is going to stitch or whatever. But I just don't have the temperament anymore to deal with that. A friend of mine recently called out someone for what I thought was a really creepy and terrifying video. And my friend literally took it down because the guy's response and his followers' response was demonic, right? And this has happened to this friend of mine who calls out people who say and do stupid shit numerous times. His account's been taken down because he's been swarmed, reported. And it's I just can't live that way. So, I mean, that's a worst case scenario. And he definitely gets into, divisive, algorithmic, sensational type stuff, although his mission is quite good. So for me, it's I don't even know if I could play that game. It also becomes a narrative not to do the video. But regain my thoughts on this one. How much of this is, I know what I was going to say. Sorry. Would sometimes we get the scam callers and I'll fuck with them sometimes. And then someone's oh, you shouldn't answer that because they'll get your voice. I'm listen, I've over 400 podcast episodes across 2 podcasts, few hundred more as a guest. You name it. Like that cat is out of the bag. My voice, there's no putting Pandora back in that box. So I guess there's probably that much video too. So what part of you just kind of says, hey, it's Pandora's box open. I can't stress this.
Yeah, I honestly don't think too much about that aspect. And what's interesting is going through that account, the one that had, made some videos using my image, they were all clipped from like other podcasts and stuff that I'd appeared on with really good recording quality. None of them were actually from my own videos anywhere. Right. So they were all like highly produced, with the perfect background, all the cameras, lighting and everything. And they took those from these, in-person podcasts I'd recorded. So I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think changing what I'd doing, at least on my end or on my own social media, I don't think that's going to change anything. And yeah, at this point, it's all out there anyway. Like, what am I going to do? Take it back?
This episode is brought to you by Renaissance Periodization and the RP Hypertrophy app. RP is the industry leader in muscle building, coaching, and education. And this app is like having a coach in your pocket. It gives you everything you need, including training programs, form videos. It gives you all your sets, reps, and weights, so you just show up and follow the plan. It adjusts each week based off your progress. And the app was created by Dr. Mike Israetel, Nick Shaw, and the team at RP, who I've known for many years. And the entire team are incredible people who've always been supportive and generous with me, so I know their character and are easy to endorse. My library contains several RP books, and I've used RP training principles in my workouts and coaching with my clients for many years, long before the explosion in popularity of their YouTube channel, which is worth checking out. RP is the first sponsor I felt remotely comfortable endorsing after over 7 years of podcasting. And if hiring a one-on-one coach isn't for you, using the RP Hypertrophy app is the next best thing to maximize your gains and take the guesswork out of your program. And there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free. If you don't like it, they'll give you your money back. And I've also got a serious discount for you of up to $50 US. Go to rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP, or go to the link below in the show notes, and that's rpstrength.com/coats. Use the code COATSRP. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
All right. So are extreme or tribal diets as prevalent among everyday people as social media makes it seem? I mean, do we really have legions of people on the carnivore diet and some of these other like crazy ones?
I mean, I suspect not. If we look at, I don't think we have good statistics on like what proportion of the population follows a carnivore diet at this point in time. I suspect it's quite low. But even if we look at, let's say, vegan diets or plant-based diets for a minute here, we see quite a bit on that on social media. We've seen it, especially back in like 2019, 2020, where it really took off. But then when you do surveys of the population at large, it usually comes back as like 1% to 2%, of the population. Like it's really not that much. And at the end of the day, I don't think most people are really thinking too much about their diets out there. Like, at the end of the day, it's really only the people that are focused on nutrition, and then probably the subset of them who are really going to social media for a lot of that are ending up, aware of these more extreme ends. Not that I would consider veganism per se or plant-based diets super extreme, or at least on the side of like a carnivore diet, or on the extreme plant-based side of like raw vegan or something. I wouldn't consider that to be like the norm. But as far as those types of diets, I think, yeah, it's primarily for that like subset of the subset of the subset of the population that ends up, coming across it.
So we don't have a lot of Freely the Banana Girls running around.
Yeah, I don't think so. And actually, funny enough, with that whole kind of area, and when I first got into plant-based eating, it was not necessarily right through that, but I was very aware of them and sort of learned about it from some people who were like adjacent to them. Funny enough, and then obviously learned more about the sort of evidence-based eating practices thereafter, as like a late teenager. But yeah, I don't think that that's the majority, and it seems to really be sort of dying off now as far as that more extreme side.
And I guess like the whole point about veganism too, like I think it probably can attract some, more extreme personalities who are almost more driven by the ideological side of it, as opposed to at the degrees of ideology as well. There are people who just like, don't want to harm animals, good-hearted and what have you. But I think there's also going to be some people like the carnivore dieters. Like there's definitely some extreme ideology that draws in people to go, hey, I want to do the most extreme thing possible. This is the one that aligns with my socio-ideological like value system more, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, like veganism is an ideology. It is, essentially striving to extend rights to animals and to, uh, not harm them or commodify them. And so, like that's, I think, a very reasonable position, and that's why most
Mhm.
people come to that way of eating. Now, veganism as that ideology can be separated from, the extreme plant-based diets that are
Mm.
for like the same type of messaging you get for carnivore, right? But carnivore, it'll be a heal all, back to our roots type of eating. And then you have the like extreme raw vegan side, or raw plant-based, I should say, whatever you want to call it, that are sort of the same. They say, it's a cure all. You can't get cancer if you eat that way. Um, you know, uh, you know, Extreme improvements in athletic performance, like all these claims that are put out there. And it's funny, and they'll say, yeah, it is our traditional or ancestral way of eating it, using different sort of reasoning. So you'll get it. You'll get the same type of messaging on both ends of the spectrum, which I find kind of funny. It'd be interesting almost to listen to like a debate between, those two extremes, and just see what sort of arguments they bring forth.
To find out that they're so far apart that they literally converged
Yeah.
together, right? You see that. In other words, you're not endorsing the documentary Game Changers.
Well, so there's parts of it, I actually think that there's a lot in there that is fine. I think there were some missteps. I think the whole thing about like the B12. In fact, if you spoke with, actually, maybe I'll give some background to people listening on what I'm talking about here. At one point in the film, and I might slightly misquote it, so excuse me on that, but they say that traditionally, we would have gotten all of our B12 from like streams or lakes, just from the water, the bacteria in the water. And they cite a study where, during a particular part of the year in a particular portion of a lake that had certain bacteria in it, that you could theoretically get enough B12 by consuming this water. And then they sort of extrapolate that out to be like, well, that could have been our traditional way to get water, from that or from eating soil or whatever. And so like for that sort of argument, for how our ancestors might have been plant-based and ate a certain way, I don't think that's very well balanced. Actually, if you were to speak to the producers of Game Changers today, and I have, they think that they might have taken a misstep on that one. And so like there are certainly things like that I wouldn't back, but then I think there's a lot there that I would back, as far as the fact that you can be a good athlete on a plant-based diet. That plant proteins can fuel muscle and strength gains. That there are health benefits to consuming a plant-predominant, plant-exclusive diet. I think those are all good messages, but there are things in there that I would certainly pick apart.
Are there any, you alluded to this, so I'll ask further. Are there any other things that like frustrate you about the more, well, let's call it the more extreme end of the vegan advocacy spectrum, who make false, misleading claims that actually like harm the, I guess the movement?
Yeah, I think, I think the biggest one, honestly, and there's like this new book going around that people have asked me to reply to. I haven't, I just haven't read it yet, about how apparently we don't need to worry about vitamin B12, that we like don't need to supplement it, that it's all a scam. Like that messaging, if people bought into it and they were adopting a plant exclusive diet or going vegan, that is dangerous. Like full stop, very dangerous. You need either fortified foods or supplements with B12. So that would be one. Now, something that I think is potentially harmful or dangerous, not to that same degree, but I think it could lead people down some roads that end up resulting in poorer health, is the idea that we don't need to worry about protein at all, or that we should ideally keep our protein intake low, around specifically the RDA, sometimes even recommending a bit below that. And this is the type of messaging we get from some of the, what I call the old guard of the sort of plant-based nutrition world. So a lot of the older docs who are, many of them now in their sort of 60s and 70s, but they started promoting, plant-based eating back in the 80s and 90s, and are still very popular today. A lot of them promote this idea of eating low protein because if we look at, certain populations, they'll point to the blue zones and so on, their protein intakes aren't sky high, but they aren't actually that low either. So that the reasoning there doesn't make a ton of sense to me. But then they'll talk about how protein harms the kidney, which we now have dozens of randomized controlled trials showing that that's not the case, at least in healthy people. We'll have some of them argue that if you increase protein intake, you promote cancer because IGF-1 goes up. Well, actually, that bump that we see in IGF-1, it's short term and post meal, and that has not been associated with cancer. What is associated with cancer is like chronically high IGF-1 levels, which is very different. That's usually due to some other sort of underlying mechanism in the body. And so I think that's one. And then if we have people who are, let's say, athletic, and they're adopting a plant-based diet and trying to like minimize their protein intake for some reason, they might be losing out on some performance, benefits there. And then maybe they ditch the diet later on because they aren't feeling the best or aren't performing the best. And then the final thing I think that I would highlight, if I'm going on too long, you can cut me off.
No, please. This is great.
Okay. And the final thing that I want to highlight, and I've spoken with tons of people about this, Simon Hill and others, is that this idea that we need to eat purely whole. So we're talking like whole grains, fruits, veggies, nuts, seeds, no oils, no other like processed, whether they're plant-based meat alternatives or more processed soy products like soy pearls and so on. No protein supplements. I think that is a recipe for potentially poor outcomes, especially in children, in athletes. And that's because, for one, children can't consume as much. Their stomachs are just as large as they can't take in the volume to get enough calories and protein and nutrition to support that, at least in many cases. Athletes often need to consume far more. It's not unusual for an athlete to need to consume 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. And if you tell them to do that on salads and quinoa, that's not going to be super easy. Or beans, I mean, they'll be farting all day. So like, it's going to be really difficult for them to do that day in and day out while training and not being all like bloated out because they're eating so much volume. So in those cases, having some of the oils to, cook down your veggies, they make them taste better. They add more caloric density, using protein shakes where needed, or using textured vegetable protein or soy curls or soy chunks, or you can do the pea-based versions or tofu, which they often allow in the whole foods version for some reason anyway, but using some of those foods, they're a little more processed down, a little denser in protein, and easier to get that protein content in, I think can help go a long ways for people in that category of, say, athletes or again for children.
Your messaging aligns so closely with my good friend Melody Schoenfeld. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Melody.
I'm not sure, no.
Oh, well, she's written a book. It's called Pleasure Not Meeting You, a science-based approach to vegan lifestyle. You would love Melody. She's been on here before. She's got a master's degree and she's just super smart. You've heard of her brother, Brad Schoenfeld.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
So, and anyway, but she's great. She's been, like I said, she's been on the podcast before. I'm going to bring her back. I just had Brad on. Okay, a little bit of a pivot. I saw you do a post about this and I love this. Are energy drinks harmful?
I would say no, generally speaking, with a couple caveats. No, so I mean that's one. It's funny. There are certain things in the sort of nutrition community, maybe not so much in the scientific community, but at least in the general population that consumes that sort of content, or at least influencers online, that everyone just unanimously hates, and there isn't good reasoning behind it. So like energy drinks would be one, seed oils, which maybe we'll touch on, or another. But with energy drinks, so, I mean, at the end of the day, what are they? They are typically caffeinated beverages. The caffeine content ranges from, I mean, I've seen them as low as 80 milligrams, which is like a shot of espresso. In Canada, maximum of 180 milligrams, which is just over a cup of coffee, maybe 1.5 cups. And then in the US, I have seen them go up to like 300, which is like 2 cups of coffee. We have limits in Canada for that. So it's much lower. So that's like the primary ingredient, so to speak, to give you that boost in energy, whether that's for working out, for target performance, or what have you. And then sometimes they'll add other vitamins and ergogenic compounds to it. So they'll add like a bunch of B vitamins, B12's almost always in there. They'll add.
Hey, so it's great for vegans. It's great for vegans.
Hey, well, you know what's hilarious about that as a tangent? I actually have a friend of mine who. He's vegan, and I mean, he does his blood work to check his values and everything, but he relied mostly on the energy drinks for the B12. Like, it's like one a day or something. It's hilarious. But anyways, so there's that. There's sometimes they use like L-theanine, sometimes L-carnitine, sometimes taurine. They'll add some other nutrients that might have some performance benefit there. Now, the one that I would have a little bit of caution around is the L-carnitine, just because there is at least one randomized controlled trial that did demonstrate narrowing of the arteries after, I think it was 6 months, it might have been 9 months of supplementation. Again, is the dose high enough in energy drinks? It's, it's hit or miss, but I would just be a little bit cautious around having that every day. And then there's also some Mendelian randomization studies where they found that people with genetically higher carnitine levels did tend to have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease as well. So again, just another reason to be a little cautious around that one. But otherwise, I mean, it's pretty benign. Another thing I would be a little concerned with is the sugar of the energy drinks. So if you're having a lot of the sugar, once in a while, not a big deal. But if that's an everyday thing, then we know that that's associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, type 2 diabetes, and so on, as far as a sugar sweetened beverage goes. So tend to go with the non-sugar alternatives as well. But overall, there really isn't good reason to be, super hard on these, people who like energy drinks. I think they're fine if used within reason or within, a reasonable caffeine hit, so to speak. The World Health Organization does recommend a maximum of 400 milligrams a day, which would generally be like a couple of those drinks. Mind you, if you're having one of those and then like a coffee or something, you'd be right around that target. But otherwise, I don't see huge issues with, having them occasionally.
What actually happens above that 400 milligrams of caffeine threshold? Now, I presume it's kind of like the threshold for aspartame, where there's a built-in buffer anyway, right? I'm going to make that assumption. And I remember there was some sort of study, a few years ago, that said something like 35 to 36 cups of coffee a day did not seem to have any adverse cardiac outcome. And I think it was a little narrow in its scope, but, to me, I conjure the images of like some poor Korean StarCraft player who's been up for 3 days on Red Bull and dies. I mean, I think those are like extreme anecdotes, but otherwise, like, we're just not seeing, cardiac event risk of things like energy drinks outside of maybe someone who's just consuming ungodly amounts of it. And then maybe associated with other unhealthy lifestyle behavior. Is that where these anecdotes?
So I think you're right. So if we look at like where you actually see either, it could be sudden cardiac death or other cardiovascular issues, it's way above that 400 milligrams, like far above. In fact, I think I cited it in my video and I can't remember the exact number, but if you were to calculate it out, it'd be a pretty crazy amount you'd have to consume in a short period of time. Now, that said, there could still be concerns with going, well above that 400 as far as, the anxiety picture or like other adverse effects of having a lot of caffeine. And that sort of depends on sensitivity. So that's the other thing, is if you are generally a bigger person and you are tolerant to caffeine, you can handle a lot more. So if you're a habitual consumer versus if you're somebody who doesn't really ever consume caffeine, and then you have, one of the Bang energy drinks from the US with 300 milligrams of caffeine, you'll be bouncing off the walls, So that's speaking from experience of a friend of mine who never drinks like coffee or tea or something. He had one. His hands are like shaking. So like there are those things to be cautious about. The 400 milligram target is a very cautious target or maximum. And I think it's reasonable to try to stay within that if you're not someone who, has been using caffeine for extended periods of time. You aren't using, say, pre-workouts and things where they're generally quite a bit higher and you're probably more used to it. But as a general rule, I like kind of aiming for around that target as a max.
Hey, I was a original Jack 3D user back in the day when that stuff was on shelves, and I'm one of the tribe. It's like, bring that shit back now. There's some other ingredients in there that I think were of concern, like geranium root. Is caffeine the primary mechanism stimulant that we're finding in these energy drinks?
Yeah. I mean, there's some potential benefit to some of the other compounds in there. Caffeine is the primary one, but what's interesting is there are studies where they'll look at the sugar-free version and the sugary version, and the one with the sugar and the caffeine actually does perform better, at least as far as the performance benefits compared to just the caffeine alone. Now, there's the flip side to that, if you're having that very regularly, again, the risks of sugar-sweetened beverages comes into play, and I'd be a little bit concerned about that. But if it's a one-off for like a race or something, I don't see too much issue with going for that version, especially since you'll be running a bunch and you're probably using gels or something anyway. That can just sort of replace it. But caffeine is certainly the primary active ingredient.
Well, the cyclists I know, I mean, their vice is Coca-Cola anyway. It's a very ritualized part of cycling. So I don't know if they'll give it up for a sugar-sweetened Red Bull. What
Yeah.
about the claim about energy drinks causing brain fog? I saw you going after some guy for that.
Oh yeah, so that's actually now you're jogging my memory. You know my content better than me. That was a response to somebody making that claim. Yeah, that's just completely false. Completely false. We have so many trials now. We have some actually because in that video he was saying Red Bull causes brain fog. I pulled
Mm,
up studies specifically using Red Bull, and the Red Bull actually improved cognitive function on a number of tests after consumption. And again, that's largely due to the caffeine. We get similar benefits with coffee or even caffeine tablets. So, before a test or something, or if you're doing something where you need to be very focused or you need to have a quick response time. I know a lot of like the Twitch gamers and stuff. Yeah, they often are having Red Bulls and whatnot. But we see that it does work for those purposes, for whether it's a test or for something that you need that cognitive function for.
it's probably better than chewing nicotine pouches or what is it? The ones that are taking Adderall. See, Adderall, like this wasn't a thing when I was in university. I'm just dating myself. I'm older. But like I've heard as I got older, like that this was actually kind of commonplace in university. And this is way off topic, so don't really want to go into it. But like just to me, that's sort of astonishing. But that was a thing. But I didn't even drink coffee in university. I started drinking coffee when I was about 37, and now I enjoy an energy drink here and there. I actually cut down a bit because I was doing the Rocks Zoas, and then now I put White Monsters back in. And honestly, White Monsters are a glorious treat.
They are good. They are good. Although I think those are pretty good too. The like we have Costco here and they have the variety packs, so you can like try the different kinds.
I that's how I started, but then they had two of the three flavors I liked and one I didn't. I don't
Uh,
know, like orange Gatorades and these orange Zoas. I don't know who drinks orange anything. It's garbage. My personal opinion. But then they flipped a second type from what I liked to another one I didn't like. So I'm like, all right, screw this. So I start ordering it on Amazon. Then I'm like, I got to give this shit up. So now I have like a couple of White Monsters a week. Anyway, so this was like self-serving to go, oh, okay, because I actually intermittently had brain fog. Uh, any longtime listeners will hear me every once in a while. I'll reference the fact that I'm dealing with brain fog and I can literally glitch and like lose what I'm, my place and things like earlier. I'm not dealing with brain fog right now. That was just me glitching. But it's like, oh shit, like I want to be very mindful. Is caffeine actually in any way contributing to this? And I don't think it does, but it's nice to ask anyway. Are there benefits from coffee independent from the caffeine?
yeah, potentially. So there's some research on decaf coffee. It's not as consistent as the research on caffeinated coffee, but I feel like that's, or I think that's in part due to just we don't have as much data on the decaf coffee specifically at a population level. But we do see some of the benefits, the exact, numbers. I couldn't cite them off the top of my head. But some of the benefits, especially for the cognitive benefits, are largely driven by caffeine. For some of the other like cardiometabolic benefits, some of it may be due to the caffeine. But there's a fair amount of it that's due to like the polyphenols and whatnot that are in the coffee.
Wonderful. Okay, let's get more into your wheelhouse a bit. Is plant-based protein inferior to animal sources of protein?
It sort of depends on what metrics you're using. So if you want to just do, if you ate the same amount of protein, and let's say you're aiming for like 1.6 grams per kilogram as is typically recommended for strength or muscle gains. If you're eating that amount of protein, does it matter if it's from animal sources or plant sources? No, it does not get the same result. And we have a couple of trials now comparing the two. We have one by Javier Lorraine out of Brazil, where they had vegans and meat eaters. They had them bump up their protein to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day in both groups. And then they resistance trained for, I want to say, I think it was 12 weeks for this trial. And then there was another trial that was a little bit shorter, but we'll say 12 weeks and similar muscle and strength gains across the board on every measure. Then there was a more recent trial by Montaigne and colleagues in, I believe, the UK, where they, again, in this case, they placed people on a plant-based diet. So in the earlier trial, they recruited vegans and meat eaters. In this one, they just recruited mostly meat eaters, and then they had, half them go on a vegan or near vegan, mostly plant-based diet, and then an omnivorous diet. And they actually supplemented the plant-based eaters with mycoprotein. So this is sort of like a mushroom-derived protein. It's not technically mushroom, but similar idea. And then the omnivores supplemented with milk protein. And then they had them resistance train. In this case, it was 5 times a week for, I believe, 10 weeks. And again, similar performance improvements across the board on every game or on every muscle strength measurement. Now, I'm not aware of any other trials that specifically pitted plant-based diets against omnivorous diets. You'll have different trials where they'll look at specific protein supplements within the context of mostly an omnivorous diet. But these are the first two that I'm aware of that actually did a complete sort of diet comparison, and you get, again, the same results. So that is what ultimately matters. Now, what will people often point to? Well, for one, they'll say that animal foods are generally more protein dense, so it's easier to get more protein. And I think that is generally true. If you were to compare meat to, I don't know, rice or something, then, well, yeah, clearly the meat has more protein density there. But if you were to replace meat with tofu, you could potentially get comparable protein content. If you compared or replaced even extra lean meat with either PVP or seitan, which is a wheat-based protein, sort of meaty type product, they're comparable. If you replace eggs with the tofu scramble, you can actually get more protein out of the tofu scramble. If you compare soy milk or pea milk to dairy milk, it's comparable or even more protein in the plant-based options. The only one that they fall short on is skim milk by a sliver. So the skim milk has slightly more protein per calorie. So it just really depends on what you're replacing. Now, the second thing people will bring up is, well, plants don't have all of the essential amino acids. I just posted about this today. That is completely false. They do have all of them, but just in varying proportions. So some foods like soy have what you would consider a pretty balanced ratio of amino acids. And then some foods like most grains or legumes are just short in maybe one or two of the amino acids. They still have them all, just not as much of certain ones. The beauty is we don't just eat one food. We eat a variety of foods throughout the day, and your breakfast will combine with your lunch, will combine with your dinner, and that'll really take care of it. It's not something that really requires a lot of thought. And then the third thing people will bring up is bioavailability. So they'll often claim that animal proteins are more bioavailable so that we absorb more protein from those sources. Now, are you familiar with the metrics that people typically cite, like the PDCAS and the DS?
Not the metrics. I've just seen this stuff and this data where, whey protein, eggs certainly score very high on bioavailability, and soy and other plant proteins tend to score lower. And then the meat ones tend to vary in the higher ranges.
Yeah. So what they're typically citing, and what it sounds like you're referring to there, are either the PDCAS or the DIAS scoring systems. And I'll just briefly overview what they look at. So the PDCAS is the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. And what they do is they will feed foods to typically rodents, and they'll measure how much protein goes in and how much comes out the other end. And the difference is presumably what was absorbed. But there's a few issues with extrapolating that to humans. For one, we have different digestive tracts, protein needs, growth rates than rodents, so we can't directly translate those. We also have some metabolism, actually same with rodents, there's some metabolism of protein in the large intestine near the end of the intestines. And so if you're looking at how much goes in versus how much comes out, you're skewing the numbers a little bit, and it could go kind of either way with that digestion that's happening due to the microbes. So it's not exactly accurate. And then to overcome, one more issue, and this is the biggest issue, is they don't just look at the amount of protein digested or absorbed. They then look at which amino acid is present in the lowest amount, and how much of that is absorbed. That's ultimately what gets scored. Okay. So let's look at it this way. Let's say you have a food with high amounts of 8 of the essential amino acids, but like half of your needs for one of the essential amino acids. And then let's say you absorb 90% of that. Okay. So for 8 of the amino acids, you'd be getting 90% of your needs from that food. And then for one of them, you'd be getting 45% of your needs because it's 90% of the 50%. Well, your score would be 45%, essentially, if I was to simplify for that food, even though you're absorbing most of all of the amino acids there. And so it's like if you had a report card, and this is the analogy that I started to use, is if you had a report card and you had straight A's on 8 subjects, and then you got like a C- on one subject. Your overall grade on the report card would just read C-. When in reality, if you were to sort of aggregate all of them, you'd probably get like a A- or something, And so they sort of unfairly skew the results against foods that have varied amino acid profiles, when in reality that doesn't matter if you're eating a mixed diet, if you're eating a variety of foods. And then, so then moving on to the DIAS scoring system, it has a lot of the same issues, but it's typically measured in pigs. They insert a tube through the abdomen into the end of the small intestine so that they avoid that microbial digestion down in the bottom of the, in the large intestine. And then they also typically use raw foods, which is another issue. So they use raw grains or raw legumes, which aren't as digestible as when they are cooked. So again, kind of skewing the results against certain plant protein sources. And of course, they also rate or score the proteins based on their limiting amino acids, similar to the other one. So it goes back to that report card analogy. So there are some serious issues with citing those numbers. But if we look at what's called true ileal digestibility, so this is just digestion from mouth to the end of the small intestine, and we have some studies where it's measured in humans. So probably the best data we have on this. When you look at overall protein digestibility, the difference between high quality animal and high quality plant protein sources is like a few percent. It's basically nothing. They're all almost identical. If you look at like really whole food sources, like cooked lentils or something like that, where it's not necessarily as refined down, and you compare that to animal protein sources, maybe you get a 5 to 10% difference. And it's not a huge difference. And at the end of the day, we can go all the way back to what I talked about at the beginning. If these differences mattered, we would have seen differences in muscle and strength gains on the trials that actually pitted them against each other and measured the muscle and strength gains, but we didn't. So at the end of the day, none of this really matters. And I think it's a little bit more clear why when you sort of understand what these are actually measuring and why they're sort of biased against some of the plant protein sources.
So there really is no reason why someone who is on a plant-based diet would actually have to consume more protein per day to effectively optimize their protein intake, correct?
Yeah, I have not seen any data support that, specifically if you are already consuming around that 1.6 grams per kilogram or more target that is typically recommended for strength athletes, whether they are consuming animal protein or not. So if you're already hitting that, there just doesn't seem to be any difference. Now, at lower intakes, you could speculate there might be small differences, and let's be clear, if there are differences, they would be small, but we just don't have data comparing that at this point. So hard to say. There's either little to no difference.
Any thoughts to how anecdotally different people show up in, let's say, populations? So if you think historically, who are the biggest, most muscular human beings? Oftentimes bodybuilders, some pro athletes, certainly people like football players, what have you. My guess is that based on self-selection, the number of people who are vegan in those populations is so small historically that, and again, who are the people, you know this better than me, who are the people who historically self-select to vegan nutrition?
I mean, I think there's people from all walks of life, to be honest. I'm just, again, this is totally anecdotal, just for people that I've met. I've met many people you'd never expect to be vegan, and then and many people who are sort of the stereotype as well. So like kind of all over the place. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we can pinpoint, what would specifically lead to someone to choosing to become vegan or adopt that lifestyle. I think there's a wide range of individuals.
I guess I suspect anecdotally one of the reasons why the idea that plant-based protein isn't as effective for muscle building is the people who self-select to like training for muscle building have historically overwhelmingly been meat eaters, right? And so that therefore you just look at the stereotypical representative population, go, well, look, it's obvious, when no, it's actually not at all. So I'm just trying to think about why does it show up in society, at least our perception that way. But I suspect you've alluded to this. We are seeing it change. There are more people who, train very hard for a lot of muscle mass, even probably competitive bodybuilders who maybe not your Olympia, stage, super elites, but you're, a person who's competing in natural bodybuilding, et cetera. I'm guessing that the proportion of plant-based, eaters is probably growing.
Yeah, I mean, I would not be surprised at all if that's the case. And I think I might have misinterpreted your question earlier, so that makes a lot more sense. But yeah, I mean, we're seeing some people. What was it? In the U.S., they're only, I believe, Olympic powerlifter in 2018, was vegan. There's a few examples of really elite lifters um, who are, now vegan, but it's just, yeah, it's a relatively small number.
And I suspect also due to the prevalence of these myths that a lot of the people who self-select to compete at elite levels probably, quite frankly, feared the idea, or they felt like, well, in order to pursue, this plant-based diet based on, like, as you said earlier, an ideology I believe in versus my goals to compete at this level, they probably believe for a very long time, well, this is a trade-off. You have to make one or the other, when in fact, based on the evidence you're presenting, you don't need to make that trade-off.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to think about it from, especially in those circles. Like imagine that you're, competing in some type of strength or power based sport, whether that's lifting or football or whatever. You're probably getting hammered left, right, and center by your teammates, by your opponents, by your coaching staff, maybe your parents, about how you need to consume the meat to perform. That if you go vegan, you're going to, shrivel up or whatever, terminology they want to use. And and that can really just, percolate in the back of your mind. It can really, cause some cognitive dissonance ultimately, and lead people to really sort of struggling with that, or maybe even resulting in a nocebo effect where just because you're expecting to not perform as well, then you end up not performing as well, or you're expecting to get sick or ill and you do, or whatever it is that you're sort of thinking is going to happen in your head.
That makes a ton of sense. This has been a fun little journey because this conversation and digging in and researching for this has actually changed and challenged some of the long held beliefs I've had because they're so pervasive. So this has been fascinating. Let's do one more question.
Mhm.
Okay. Can you explain the toxic plants narrative? The compounds that are found in plants. It's usually some idiot walking through a grocery store aisle. You'll often hear, oxalates in spinach is one of the ones. There's other ones. People like, I'll say his name. David Asprey, I know, makes up shit like this. Um, Paul Saladino, the carnivore doc, is one of the ones that does this crap. So yeah, so what's going on there?
So, for starters, I would say that anybody who is interested in this topic should read. There's a review and it's open access called "Is There Such Thing as Anti-Nutrients?" I can't remember which journal it was published in, but if you type that in and into PubMed, I'm sure it pops right up. Really good review that covers the big ones, the oxalate, the phytates, and the lectins. Now, it's also funny that you mentioned Dave Asprey because he makes a lot of crazy claims around oxalates. And one thing that he started that I think has just propagated is this idea that kale is high in oxalate. So you always pick on kale, but kale is actually a low oxalate green. So he's just wrong. Like it's the wrong green to pick on because it's low in oxalate. It's literally recommended for people who can't consume a lot of oxalate. So that's funny. Now, at one point he made a video just, hammering oxalate. Then I commented asking for sources and he told me that they were in his book. So then I actually went to his book and I looked for the references and there were zero references in the oxalate section. And I pointed that out and then he blocked me. So there's that. But anyways, let's cover those three really quick: the oxalates, phytates, and lectins, because I think those are the most common ones. So with oxalate, now, it is true if you're prone to kidney stones that you could, that oxalate consumption, especially from high oxalate foods like spinach or beet greens, they could potentially increase risk of kidney stones. And there was a study, the Nurses Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-up Study, that in a subset of the population that was consuming low amounts of calcium, they did increase risk of these kidney stones. However, in those consuming the higher amounts of calcium, and I can't recall the cutoff. It was still below what is the daily recommendation is, so it wasn't very high. But those consuming above that threshold were not at high risk of kidney stones, and that's because the calcium and the oxalate, they bind together, so you don't get as much absorption of them. Now, of course, that could minimize calcium absorption to a degree, but also reduces the risk of the kidney stones. So the message there is that if you're going to be consuming oxalate-rich feed, and if you are prone to kidney stones, having more calcium is a good idea. But I certainly wouldn't rely on high oxalate greens for my calcium, just because of that issue with the absorption. Now, with but otherwise, oxalates don't really seem to have much of a harmful impact. The oxalate-containing vegetables are also generally healthy vegetables. They're associated with good health outcomes, and that's ultimately what matters. Like, we can speculate about these compounds and plants or whatever, but if at the end of the day eating those foods is associated with lower risks of mortality, lower risks of cardiovascular disease, then why wouldn't we consume them, provided you're not one of those people at risk of kidney stones? Now, phytates are another one. Phytates combine certain minerals, particularly iron and zinc. And there are some studies that show that when you eat high amounts of phytates with iron containing foods, for example, you absorb less iron at that meal. But here's the issue. These studies are done in isolation. They're single meals. So you'll take people who maybe don't regularly consume tons of phytates, which are found in like grains and nuts. And then you give them a bunch of these phytates with the iron and they don't absorb as much. But when you look at longer term studies, so studies done over several weeks or a couple months, you see that actually over time, that impact diminishes. So if you regularly consume these phytate containing foods, like again, these whole grains or nuts and seeds, it no longer has that negative impact on iron absorption. So it's just a temporary thing when you start to consume more. And at the end of the day, higher phytate levels, at least measured in the urine, are associated with better bone health parameters. So that's good. Again, these foods, whole grains, nuts, and seeds, are associated with lower risks of mortality, cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, et cetera. And then finally, lectins. These are proteins found in a wide range of plant foods. And it is possible to get lectin poisoning from, say, red kidney beans if you don't cook them. But the solution there is to cook them. And cooking for or boiling for even 15 minutes, which is less than we would typically cook them to make them edible, almost, if not entirely, eliminates the lectins down to either safe levels or undetectable levels. And again, legume consumption is associated with lower risks of all-cause mortality, coronary heart disease, etc. So these are, again, very healthy foods. And so what you're seeing when people point to plant toxins as a broad category or any of these individual foods, they're sort of speculating that because in a certain context they can have X effect, that effect broadly applies, when in reality, if we step back and look at, okay, when people actually consume them and cook them the correct way, what are the health outcomes? And they tend to be good health outcomes. And so we always have to step back and look at what is the end result. That's what we should care about. And if the end result is, better health outcomes, then fantastic. Let's promote consumption of those foods.
There's one other piece that I understand about, anything in plants that are potentially toxic. It might be toxic to something the size of an insect, right? In terms of like dose relative to the mass of literally a living being, right? Whereas, insects are literally minuscule compared to the size that we are. So something that might actually be harmful to protect plants from pests would be so minuscule as to have like literally no effect on humans whatsoever. So that's one of the other interpretations that I've always had about some of these claims. This has been enlightening. This has been great, engaging. I hope everybody will go and dig into more of your media, especially anybody who finds emotional resistance to, a lot of my long held beliefs have been challenged here, and there's been evidence presented that, counteracts a lot of those things. So I try to come into these conversations with an open mind. So they can follow you on Instagram at dr.matthewnagra. So at dr.matthewnagra. Is there anywhere else you'd want to send people?
You can follow me on any of the social media platforms, just my name, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, or X, or whatever you want to call it now. So all of those platforms. Then I also have a website where I'll link, episodes like this one and sometimes put together slightly longer blog posts where I'll aggregate stuff from different, Instagram reels or whatever that I've done, just to, if people want to kind of read it all in one place. So those are all places that you can check me out, and you can of course send me a message on Instagram or something, and I try to get back to as many as I can.
Thank you. This has been spectacular. I really appreciate your time. Thanks everybody for tuning in.